I have access. Well, this presentation is going to be about the access layout grid, and the presenter today is going to be me, Ebro, and I'm principal consultant at Exacto, a small access and SQL Server development company. And some of you may also know me as the Smiley Coder, or might have visited my blog, thesmileycoder.com, with some demos on how to do stuff, especially with treeviews and some other code examples. So the agenda for this session is going to be about, well, the layout grid. And what is the layout grid? How can we use it for design time assistance? What are grid lines? What are padding? We're going to show something about how it can help us in runtime and how we can use anchoring. And finally, some coding involving using the layout grid. But before I start that, I just want to say a few words about myself. As I already mentioned, my name is Ebro and also known as the Smiley Coder. I'll skip this because you guys already know this. So wait, what is the Access layout grid? So the layout grid was first introduced in Access 2007, and it's really something to help you design your forms. It's sort of like a table-like overlay for your controls, kind of similar to how you have HTML tables. And I think the HTML tables is what inspired the layout grid. You can use it both for design time assistance when you're adding new controls, when you're resizing controls, moving controls around, trying to make sure your forms are consistent, looking nice, but also for runtime assistance in terms of scaling or resizing your forms. So there are two main layout types, which are called stacked and tabular. And I usually use stacked when we're talking single view forms, and I use the tabular for our continuous forms. And there's this bug in Access that sometimes after you've saved and you reload a form, under certain circumstances, if you're using the tabular layout, it will switch and become a stacked layout. But the layout type seems to only affect your experience during design time, so it doesn't affect how it lays out when your users are using it. And let's see stacked layouts. What's special about them is that when you're adding new controls, if it's the stacked layout, it's going to place the label on the left side of the control like you're used to. But if it's a tabular layout, it's going to go ahead and add the label to the header. So let's do a demo of how that looks. If we have our regular table and we go ahead and create a form, a single view form, we have our controls here. And these are all in the layout grid. You can see this layout grid when you click the small resize or move icon up here. You see they move as a group, and you can see all of these controls are in the grid, and you can see the outline of the grid with this small dotted line. And if we add something to this form when it's in single view form, if we add a field, now I know this field is already there, but if I go ahead and add it, what happens is that since this is a stacked layout, the label belonging to our control is added on the left side. If we try to create a continuous form and we add a control, you can see that the label gets automatically added up to the header. If you're doing this without using a layout, which you can see if we just quickly switch to design view, select all of our controls, and we can go ahead and say remove layout. And if we're back in layout view as we was before, and we try to add a control, First of all, you can see there's no indication of where the control is going to be added. Oh, it just showed up over here, and it automatically decided for us that since it's a continuous form, we probably want to do a tabular layout, and added the label up here. But it didn't add into our form. It didn't automatically fit and resize. If we look at how it looks when we do the continuous form, and we add here, you can see the small line here is trying to indicate where should this control be added, and it automatically pushes the other controls aside to make space. And as we resize our form, you see that the other controls are automatically moving, and this is part of what the layout grid does for us. It automatically adjusts the other controls on our form. Now, before I go any further, I just want to ask, how many of you use the layout grid?
Rarely.
I seldomly use it because I don't use continuous forms very often.
Okay, so let's go back to.
Like it's awkward to apply changes.
So why is it awkward to apply changes?
I have to feel like I have to resize all the different columns.
Okay.
I haven't
So
used it that much. I'll say that.
Yeah. So if we go into the single view form here, you can see if I resize, first thing I notice is that all of my controls are resizing, which I personally usually think is a really nice feature about this. You don't have to go and resize each of them individually. You don't have to make sure that, oh, well, if I've resized this, I should probably also resize all of these other controls. And if I want to move this just a tad to the left or to the right, I don't have to, go ahead, select all of the other controls and align them. So for me, this makes it a lot easier. Now, if you do, of course, this assumes that all of my controls are the same size. They have the same width. But let's say we have some controls that we want to, let's say we have the termination date and the hire date down here. We want to combine them on one line because neither of these controls are going to be that wide. So if I go into design view, what I can do is I can merge or split my control. And if I split it horizontally, you see I get an extra box added here, sort of like when you do merge and split in Excel. And you can see my hire date width, the width of this field was cut in half. I can go ahead and delete my termination date label and move my termination date up here. And I'll just call this start and end instead, and delete this empty row that was left over. And now you can see now I have both my controls on the same line. And if we're in layout view, I can resize them as well. And admittedly, sometimes, see, as I resize this control, it can be annoying that the layout grid decides that, oh, well, let's resize the entire form. And you can see sometimes it's, some of it is a matter of getting used to the quirks of it. Is if I resize it in this way by selecting this control, the whole form doesn't resize. But doing it here, all of the control resizes.
Okay, Anis, how well does it handle list boxes and option groups?
Perfectly well.
Okay.
I don't see there should be any difference about that. I don't often use list boxes, but they should be just the same, really. So another thing I like about this is the padding. And if we select all of our controls and we quickly decide we want to have more space around our padding or around our controls, we can go select all of our controls, go up under the arrange and say padding. So, well, I want these to be really close together. So I'll select the narrow padding. All of my controls move closer together. And on top of that, they're consistently closer together. It's not like I have to go manually try to get that pixel perfect alignment of my controls and try to make sure that they're all exactly the same distance from each other. The padding will do this for me. That said, I can select an individual control and look at the properties and say, well, I want the bottom padding to be even more than it is now. Oh, that was the left padding. So you see, I've decided that I wanted more padding here. I want more distance between these. It's also an easy way to group my controls together and select all the controls within my group and say, well, I want some margins on my controls. There we go. So was there any specific feature or issue you had with that made it difficult to use the layout grid?
I don't know about difficult. One thing I don't like, and it comes from being an old-time Access developer. For example, you've got oodles and oodles and oodles of space for ID number 1. That just grates against me. But it does look nice, I have to admit that.
Okay, this is still the same. You can go and say, split it horizontally and say, well, I want it like this. Or you can split it even more if you want to make sure that, right now these two controls are following each other. They're in the same column. So as I said, there's a table-like overlay to this. It's going to say this is column 1, column 2, column 3.
Okay.
And we can go ahead and split this even more. And if you do have a very complex form, it can start to get extremely complex to keep track of all the columns and how it's split. But now you can see, now I have my ID column just the way I want it. I'll go ahead and say it's accidentally got a bit more padding than I intended it to have. Now we have our ID not taking up as much space, but the rest of the controls do have this consistent width, and we can resize them together.
I have to admit, you're making this look pretty interesting. Keep going.
So let's see. Again, with the continuous form, I personally like to see. I personally like to make the padding narrow or none for a continuous form, and to make sure I use these margins. How many of you play around with margins for your controls?
All the time.
All the time. Okay. I like them a lot. They do make these forms look a lot nicer. Just remembering to add that small bit of margin. If there's no margin, it kind of looks weird and crunched together. But just having even a narrow margin, in my opinion, makes it look a lot nicer. You can also go ahead and say, well, I don't want any padding at all, which also is good for a consistent or for a continuous form. You do get that closer to a data sheet type view. And a good idea is to go in, if you do want to have no padding, also to go in, take the control and set the top, if I can find it, there we go, to 0. As you can see here, there seems to be this, even though we had no padding, there seems to be this small padding between the lines, which stems from the fact that our form has a top. So this small line at the top, very small, almost invisible line, is being, see it here, is being repeated since it's a detail section. So if we go ahead and set the top to 0 and move the bottom up, we now skip that. We can also go ahead and use the grid lines. This is where I also find it becomes interesting, because all of these has borders, and it right now it looks a bit chunky to me. Or blocky, if that's even a real word. So let's go ahead and remove the borders and say the border style should be transparent. Now we don't have anything that really separates the lines besides from the varying colors. But if we go ahead, select all of our controls, and say, well, I want a grid line. You can see per default, grid lines are all transparent. We can select one style. So let's say at the bottom here, we say this one should be solid. And I want the grid line color. Let's make it accent 1. And we can even say set the width. I'm not going to do that right now. But now we have a line between each of our records without having to draw a line. I mean, we could do the same drawing a line in the design view, but then we also have to make sure each time we redesign the form that we should move this line. And I'm sure a lot of you have tried. You do a form redesign, you think it's all good, and then you switch it over and you figure out, oh, I forgot to move the line that I drew as well. You could also go ahead.
The dividing lines property that's already available in a continuous form.
But you can't set the dividing lines color, can you?
I don't think so, unless it's part of a theme.
So here you can set, for
Okay.
the grid, you can select one color. You can't select a color per top, bottom, left, right. You can select a style for each of them, but not a color. There's only one color. You can also go ahead and say, well, on this, I also want to have my right style should also be, or it should be dashes. So we separate our ID column. So now we have, well, the dashes don't look good here. But you can see we can play around with this where we used to have to do this by adding lines, and we had to remember to move the lines if we change the design. If we're in layout view, you can see if I make changes to say the width, grid lines move along with my form, so I don't have to continuously adjust my lines to match my new updated design. So going back to my presentation, let's see if I skipped anything. So as I already said, this helps us to make sure controls are aligned. This also helps us when we're adding new controls that, as I said, if we add a new field, the other controls are automatically pushed down. And there is definitely quirks with this that you see. I probably didn't mean to add my control at this point. Sometimes it's about choosing the right insertion point. Well, yeah, there's another thing with this. When you add controls, let's say we've gone ahead and decided that for this form, we want the first 3 columns to have a special look. We've gone ahead and specified that these should be different color, not the most pretty color in the world, but what happens when we add a control? If this was if we didn't have a layout and we add a control, well, the control would just take off the default of the form. But you can see if I add department here, it's going to inherit the formatting of the control to the left of it. If I do the same and try to add it over here, again, it inherits the layout of the control to the left of it. So now it doesn't inherit the color because the control to the left of it didn't have a color. So if you have forms that you've done a lot with formatting, this can help you to easily replicate that layout without having to do format painting. And if you do want the control in a different place, you can always just insert it first. You insert it, say, over here, and then move it over here, because when we move the control, it doesn't inherit the layout. It's only when we add new controls. And when we use the continuous form and we do redesigns, you can also see both the header and the detail sections are automatically adjusted to our new redesign. So what about grid lines? I've already showed some way of using grid lines. You can see a different form here. How many of you, if you've tried to create something like this in a report, have ended up with a lot of code trying to draw lines like this?
I didn't know you could do this in reports. You got my interest now.
So, well, I've definitely had to do stuff like this in reports, and there's a lot of trying to calculate the coordinates that I want, or be like, so this control dot left dot top, start the drawing there and draw it to this control and add a bit of margin for errors or fudge factors. But there's no code behind this. This is all done by Gridlines. And if we try to look at it in a layout view, we can see that we have 3 detail records here. We have a footer, or a footer here. We have the detail section. We have the page header. And the control here has its left grid line set to solid, giving us the border over here. And the same goes for the control down here. So this gives us easy way to, using the grid lines, to specify a grid without having to do a lot of code. And you can get this sample database if you want, and you can see how all of the grid lines are set.
Yeah, I could see it being useful in reports. I never thought about that.
So, so what about what I call, this was all design time assistance. This is what helps us design stuff faster and designing stuff with more consistency between our different forms. But what about resizing forms? How many of you use the anchoring?
All
I do
the
all the
time.
time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
So anchoring is a great feature, but it's a lot more powerful than most people realize. So let's try to look at, you see these buttons down here. Notice how if I redesign my form, the buttons always stay centered. The header up here is always on the right side. Even my image is being resized on the fly, and there's no code doing this. This is all anchoring. If we try to look at how it looks, what I have down here is my buttons in the middle. I have an empty cell on the left, and the empty cell on the left has anchoring set to stretch across bottom. The cell over here on the right contains my sort value for the slider, which is hidden, but the anchoring is also stretch across bottom. So the effect is that the empty control here and the empty control here will both stretch and fill out the space. making sure that my 2 buttons always stay in the middle.
Are your 2 buttons then defined as upper left?
So we can have a look at them. Anchoring here is bottom left. Anchoring here is bottom left.
Okay.
I think they could probably also be top left. And there's definitely some quirks with the anchoring as well. If you try to delete one of the controls, sometimes the surrounding controls will lose their anchor setting, which can be a pain because you might not notice it immediately. I'm sure you're all aware of this being anchored top, stretched across top and then right aligned to make sure it always stays on the top right side. And my other controls here, my text box here is set to stretch down and across to make sure it fills up the entire space. How about if we've no, I'm still missing this for my demo. Let's see.
Can I add something real fast to what you were talking about? Maybe you're heading there. By the way,
Yep.
Hi guys, sorry I'm late. I ran long with the meeting.
Hi, Aaron.
Hey, so I don't know if you were going to show this or you guys have known this, but one of the things I've used this for, very similar to what you were doing, is if I had, let's say I have a tab control that has 2 subforms, one on top of the other. And what I really want is for both of those guys to auto grow vertically to both take up half of that tab. And if that makes sense, hopefully it does, because it's not can't be visual right now. You can use this layout to do that. And by putting both of those subforms each in its own table cell, and then turning on the auto grow, what's it called? The resizing? Anchoring, thank you. It'll actually do that for you automatically. It's really cool. So anyway, I just wanted to add that in, thanks.
It's the same principle as down here, except you're anchoring them vertically instead of horizontally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good point. I should probably include that in my demo as well. So let's see what we have next. So I'm going to show some of my runtime code that uses the layout grid in a probably untraditional manner. So let's try to create a new form. So we want to allow the user to sort easily on our different columns up here. So if we go into our design view, look at our code. So I have some pre-made code for my toolbox forms. I add layout sortability to me. And I also want to make sure that when we close down the form that we clean up after ourselves. So toolbox forms dot clean up layout sortability me. So let's see what happens when we use this. Now, if I click any of the column labels up here, it will sort on that column label and also automatically add a visual indicator, an arrow saying that, well, we're sorting this way or we're sorting that way. You can do the same for job titles or department. And all of this functionality was really just a single or 2 lines of code, really. But how do we achieve all of this? Let's take a look at the code and see how it works. So when we start adding layout, one of the things we do is that we make sure that we have a sortable layout collection master. So why do I have the collection over here? One of the other ways of doing it might be to have a variable declared up here. as layout, label, sortable, blah, 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 but I don't want to have to add that extra line of code to each of my forms. I'm just being really lazy. So instead of adding it to each form, I just pass it into the toolbox forms, the reference to myself, and then I have my collection of my forms up here. So when I add my layout sortability, I make sure that if the collection master is nothing, then we start one. Then I start a collection, a new collection, another new collection. So I have a collection master, which is going to contain other collections, and these collections are collections of controls. So for each control in my form, I make sure if they're a label, I'm interested in them. If they're text box or something else, I'm not going to be sorting on them, so I'm only searching for labels. And if I find one, I create a new layout label, and I initialize it by passing the control reference, and then I add it to my collection so it stays in memory, and finally I add my collection to my collection master. If we go look at the init part of it, I make sure when I initialize it to store the original caption. This is what makes it easy for me when I click somewhere else to reset the caption to whatever it was originally. And I loop through all of the controls. So I passed in the employee name. Then I loop through all of the controls in the form when I initialize it and say, well, if we're an empty cell or a command button, then we're not interested. And I make sure that they're in the same layout by looking at the layout ID. So if I have more than one layout, which I, for instance, do here, this is a different layout than the layout down here. So they will have their own unique layout IDs. And if the control I'm looping has the same column start as the label I'm looping, basically saying, so this is column 0, this is column 1. So if I find a control within the same layout that is also in the same column as my label, then that is the control I'm interested in. So that is my bound control. I also make sure that they're bound, because if they're not bound, it doesn't make sense to sort on them. This is my take on it. And then I add event handlers to listen into the click event. That was done there. And the click event really does the rest. So the click event, we've already found out what's the bound control. So when we click one of our labels, we first strip any sort markers, which is saying that if we already had an arrow, we should strip that out. Then we know what the control source is. And this is just code to reset the sort and set the at the up arrow or the down arrow. Finally set the order by equal to the control source, and we make sure that if the order by is not on, then we turn it on.
If you do a third click, does it clear out the sort?
No.
Okay.
We could add that.
Yeah.
One of the things I've considered trying to add but haven't done yet is, like, if you select this employee name first and then shift click another column, then it should add that to the sort instead of replace the sort. But I haven't really gotten there yet.
Yeah, this is really cool, by the way. Everything you showed so far is really cool.
I think a third click to clear it could make sense, but what are you really sorting on then? Then you're sorting on the form's original sort, which the user doesn't know what is.
That's a really good point.
Although you could argue that maybe the user would want to return to the original sort even if he doesn't actually know what it is. He just wants to return to what it was. So that was
an argument for that would be when you open it up, it doesn't show a sort.
Mm-hmm.
So now that you have an arrow, that means you did sort, and how do I get it back to what it was?
Yep.
I might want to just get it back to what it was.
I've also thought about trying to make this smarter so that in the original, in here, when it adds this, it could pick up the sort from the form and add. So let's say if it picks up that the form is sorted by employee name, it could go ahead and add that arrow for me automatically. So there are ways I could improve this, but I haven't really gotten beyond this simple sort. But I found it very useful. So let's see what else we could do. So I think I've already shown this key navigator, which that doesn't have anything to do with. So what I want to do now is I want to make it easy to search this form. I don't want to have to add a separate search form for it. So I'll just go ahead and copy all of these controls and insert them into the header, move them down. So now I have duplicate controls in my header. And I'm just going to clear out the control source. Now they're all unbound. Resize them a bit. And go ahead and set the tag. And this is, of course, something I've defined that it should look like this. See, I set it to, I use a XML-like syntax to say search control true, end search control. So this is just the tag I use. And by using this XML-like syntax, it makes it easier to add, in my opinion, more than one tag if you should so desire. Code. And I've recently, there's a while since I did this, so I'm trying to remember it. So I have a class called autofilterForm. Make a new one, and I initialize it. And I don't recall if I have to do anything else, but I will make sure that I clean it up. And save my form. So let's see how that works, if I forgot anything. And I have to pass in reference to myself. So I have these controls up here. Let's see if it works. If it works, I can just write something up here. And of course it doesn't work. I have to add my base SQL. I forgot about that. So my base SQL is what should the SQL look like for my form if I'm not doing any changes to it. So I think this is messing up because I never intended it to be used on something that doesn't have, or that has spaces in the name. It's a good thing I'm doing a demo so I can filter out these things before I go live on Sunday. I'm just going to really create a different form based on this setup employee instead. And clear out the control source. Add the search control tag. There we go. Add the load event. Initialize it. And make sure to clean it up again. Let's see if it works now. Demo 2. So let's see, now it's supposed to automatically add filtering. So let's say I want to filter on everything that contains the number 16. My form is automatically filtering on these values. It is using a like syntax. So I could also say I want all the numbers that start with B4, contains B4 or contains BB4. And it might be difficult to see. As I type, as I leave the field, it will automatically filter. So now I have values starting with BB46, for instance. Or as it is searching on like, I can also search on the years. And all of this is now turning my simple form into a searchable form with just a couple of lines of code. And I'll see if I can update it to include field names that have spaces in them. Any questions on this rather messed up demo?
This is super cool. Really, really cool. Are you willing to share the code?
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting to see it, how the reusability of it.
So I have one more thing on my demo, and I'll see what I'll do in terms of making my actual presentation last 30 minutes more. Let's go back and take a look at this demo here, and I'll just make sure to reset these parts here. So now we just have original form working. But one of the things that is really nice about data sheets is that users can resize columns. What if we could do the same for continuous forms? So let's try to add that to our form. So toolbox forms, add resizability to controls. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to say me, and then I'm going to say what is the resize mode. So this is a continuous form. I want to allow users to resize only the width. So that's what I'm going to set. And again, I use the same syntax for cleaning it up. Clean up resizability, me. So form still looks the same, but if the user goes anywhere near the edge of the control, you can see the mouse cursor changes. And if he clicks, he can drag the controls. Part of what makes this easy to do is the fact that they are in a layout grid, because I don't have to move the other controls around. I'm just adjusting the width of this single control, and the layout grid is doing all the rest of the work for me by rearranging the other controls. We can do the same for a single view form. So we have our single view form here. Go into design view, save it, form, resize, demo, and let's go again and look at the code. And for this form, we want to allow users to both resize in width and height. So we're in form view, we're not in design view, just to make sure you're aware. Now the user can say, well, I want this field to look like this. Or I don't want the employee name to take up so much space, but my department names should have more space.
What happens when the user closes and reopens the form? Do those settings get saved?
I'm not saving any of this, but in theory you could. But then you run into that whole issue of what if the developer adds a field? How would that work?
Right.
Yep. So I think that is what I had to show, which is ready. I have a few more things, but I didn't actually finish them in time for this demo. Any questions on this last part?
None here.
I'm going to reiterate, this is way cool. I mean,
Thank
this
you.
is, yeah, it's one of those things where you see it and you think, why didn't they just bake this in? Because it's really the best of, I love datasheet view because of the flexibility it gives users, but you're limited by certain things. You know, buttons is a good example, but by using this, you really get to the best of both worlds. You can be more flexible, you can add a button to each row, and give the user the ability to filter, sort, all that cool stuff. So yeah, thank you for sharing this.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Welcome. I'll share the database once I've finished just wrapping it up for the presentation on Sunday. Then I'll share it.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that. Good luck.
I know this was a. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just said good luck with the presentation.
Yep. Thank you. I think this was a bit more unrehearsed than I had hoped for, but at least I got some practice in before Sunday. So thank you for listening to me.
No problem. Thank you, Anis. It was actually very good. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah,
All right,
my
folks.
pleasure.
Is that it for today then?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Sorry I was late.
It's good hearing all of you and seeing some of you. We'll see each other again, who knows when, but hopefully not too long. Goodbye, guys.